Donald Trump has lately been screaming blue murder about the election being rigged, or at least the attempt of the election to be rigged. And I have to agree with him somewhat about the attempt. I'm going to play this particular clip from the Chris Hayes show, and then I'm going to tell you why I think that he is somewhat correct, but not in the way that he thinks.
And I'm afraid the election's going to be rigged, I have to be honest. I'm telling you, November 8th, we better be careful because that election's going to be rigged. And I hope the Republicans are watching closely or it's going to be taken away from us.
One of Donald Trump's many conspiracy theories is that if he loses the election, it's because the election is rigged. Not because he's, right now polling 10 points behind. It's not just him. Surrogates like Roger Stone, TV personalities like Fox News host Sean Hannity have toed the line. And polling shows supporters are primed to believe it. According to a new poll in North Carolina, nearly 7 in 10 Trump supporters said if Clinton wins, it's because the election was rigged. Now, such talk is incredibly toxic. It goes well beyond opposing policies, the opposition party, and it's reminiscent of the years-long effort to delegitimize the entire Obama presidency. Joining me now, resident scholar at the American Enterprise Institute, Norm Ornstein, also contributing writer for The Atlantic and co-author of It's Even Worse Than It Looks, and MSNBC political analyst Nina Turner, former Ohio state senator. Norm, let me start with you because you wrote about this. You wrote about this kind of particular toxicity of pushing this, which is now something that Donald Trump is talking about a lot. Why do you find it so unnerving?
Well, first, Chris, one thing we have to keep in mind is that unlike Iraq, where he was for the war before he was against it, in 2012, Trump made the same kinds of accusations on election eve, that the election had been rigged, that Romney had won by a huge margin in popular votes, that we were a loser nation, and he called for a revolution. So this isn't new for him. But in the same way, if you delegitimize the entire political process, you cannot govern in this country. The founders created a system where you try to build at least some broad consensus that the process is legitimate, even if you don't get the outcomes that you want. And if you delegitimize not just the president, as we saw with Barack Obama, but the entire political process, and people believe that the president who's been elected is an illegitimate president, you can bring about, as we saw he did in 2012, a call for a revolution, which is another incitement potentially to violence, but you're going to have no acceptance of any of the policies that emerge and probably no ability to enact policies. It's a terrible thing.
Nina, I wanted to get your thoughts on this because Trump likes to sort of troll the Bernie Sanders supporters and say, they rigged it against Bernie and they tried to rig it against me and it's going to be rigged. And it seems to be conflating the difference between primaries, which do have weird sets of rules created by parties as sort of internal contests, and the broader rules of the American election, which are quite different. What's your reaction to it?
That's right, Chris. There is a difference. I mean, it's one thing to argue, as Senator Sanders did and other pro-voter types, to say that we need open primaries, so therefore everybody gets a chance to vote and have a bite at the apple. There's a different thing in saying that the entire election system, the general election, will be rigged. And Chris, quite frankly, the Republicans have been singing the same sad song for a long time. As you know, in Ohio, places like North Carolina, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, those of us in the legislature have really had to endure Republicans really using public policy to take away access to the ballot box for poor people, for people of color. And I remember in Ohio, and the point that you made earlier about as soon as President Barack Obama was elected, let's just be honest, as soon as a black man was elected, all of a sudden my Republican colleagues went cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs, and they could not believe that he was legitimately elected. And that was when they really started on this trail of making it harder through public policy for African Americans in particular, other people of color, elders, young people to vote. And what we should be doing in this country is really pushing for elections to expand and protect the access to the ballot box. So this is not new, Chris.
Norm, that point about the sort of, and your point about the delegitimization sort of existing earlier, I mean, you had polling in 2009 where majority of Republican voters thought Acorn stole the election. You have Donald Trump now on the trail saying people are voting 15 times, which is not true. People don't, I mean, it's just not a myth. But this is one place where Trump seems a kind of continuity of certain seeds that have been sown before.
Absolutely, and I think Nina is very much on point here. All of these efforts to restrict voting, and it's not just voter ID laws, it's cutting early voting days, it's cutting the number of polling places and the like, are justified on the basis of voter fraud, which we know at the polls is virtually non-existent. And if you're arguing that there's massive voter fraud, you're suggesting that elections are illegitimate, or at least that a lot of voters are illegitimate. So Trump is playing right into that wheelhouse. And of course, this is also the guy who led the birther movement trying to delegitimize President Obama.
Nina, there's something profound also, it just strikes me, as just how much everything's all held together by people essentially accepting legitimacy. And legitimacy is this kind of, it's a difficult thing to identify, but people feel it or they don't. There are elections that happen in other places of the world that are illegitimate because people don't trust them. And that's really playing with fire.
It is, Chris, and we are in a synergistic moment in our country where people, because of the suffering or the feeling that the system is not working for them, I think are more prone to feed into what Mr. Trump is saying. So it's quite a tragedy that he is really playing into those fears. You know, my grandmother used to say that you can put truth in the river 5 days after a lie, but truth is going to catch up. And the truth of the matter is catching up with Mr. Trump in terms of he is just flat out losing this election, and it is patently unfair, undemocratic, with small d, and un-American to really try to take the electoral process.
All right, Norm Ornstein, Nina Turner, thank you both for your time. That is all.
All right, so as I was saying, the election, there was an attempt to rig the election, and that attempt was made by Republican governors and legislatures all over the country. They were trying to rig the election by getting rid of all of the votes they could that were centered in the African American community, the Hispanic community, students, and the elderly. They enacted all of these laws for voter IDs, and in Kansas's case, which was unbelievable, you had to show up with a birth certificate or a passport in order to register and in order to vote. Fortunately, the courts are striking down these laws, and the majority of them, thus far, there have been 8 states that have had their voter ID, or I call it voter suppression laws, struck down or moderated to a point that most people will be able to exercise their ability to vote. Now, there are another 14 states that lawsuits have been filed in order to either strike down the heinous voter restriction laws, or at least to moderate them so that a larger number of people will be able to vote. It's been found that the picture ID portion of it in some cases is not overbearing, but it's the form of picture ID that has been rejected, so that now students can use their student IDs as a form of identification, where here in Texas they weren't allowing them to do so. But situations like in North Carolina, where it was blatant that they were trying to knock down the African American vote by restricting early voting. They knocked a week off of early voting. They weren't allowing voting registration on the weekends, especially Sunday. They knocked down the number of polling places, and a couple of other things that they did, and it was specifically targeted at African American voters. Places like Alabama, where they required picture IDs, but then they turn around and close 26 motor vehicle offices, lawsuits filed, so they turn around and reopen those 26 motor vehicle offices one day a month. They also have reduced the number of actual polling places where you vote, so that it becomes a hardship for people to have to travel great distances, especially if they don't have transportation in order to cast their ballots. So yeah, I got to agree with Mr. Trump. The election was in the process of being rigged, but it was being rigged by his buddies in the GOP. Fortunately, as I stated, judges are knocking these laws down and are forcing these states to go back to a more open and available election for regular people.